Welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Barnes from Boston University. And she's been working in various ways of using AI for climate modeling and like whole Earth system modeling. Welcome, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you, everybody. So my background is in climate science, and really I work these days at the intersection of climate and data science with a particular focus on how do we use AI to do our science better and understand the world around us. And I'm going to talk today about some of the approaches we're taking. This was a really fun talk to put together because I tried to focus on the work that we're doing that's newest and most exciting, which means a lot of it's sort of just being written up now. So any questions or suggestions I would love, just because this is the time to actually have an impact on that work. So AI for weather and climate has arrived. I know this group has already heard from other people working in this space, and Google itself has quite a bit of work in this space. And I'll talk about that throughout. So just to be clear, it's here, it's really exciting, it's a lot of fun. I just want to talk through a few standard examples that are making a huge impact on the weather and climate space. So an example here is using AI for tailored predictions. So you can think of numerical weather prediction. In this case, this is thinking about severe hazard forecasts that are becoming operational. Another is for post-processing, tons of work now going into downscaling, something that has been really hard for us to do pre-AI, and now AI is potentially going to really open this door for impact studies. AI in general, just to improve our physics-based models. So rather than replacing the full model, going in and trying to make certain aspects or the physics of the model better, in this case, focusing on cloud processes. Something that we're just seeing really start to pick up in the research community is the fact that we can now merge our model data and our observations in new ways, and they don't require full data assimilation pipelines like they did before. What that means is we can actually leverage observations quite a bit better than we could in the past. I think this is particularly exciting for the future of the field. Another one I just like to point out to folks is actually climate change communication is something that is very important, and the visualization process by people visualizing what the world looks like under different climates or different environmental impacts is incredibly powerful. And now AI, I mean, these are old examples, but AI now I think has a role to play in that visualization process. And then finally, what I'm really going to focus on today is the idea of deep learning weather and climate emulators. So what I'm going to talk about is really focusing on the models that were trained, that are purely data-driven models, trained in many cases on reanalysis. So often you hear some people talk about Era 5. So trained on reanalysis to fully reproduce the state of the Earth system at any given time. So here's an example of one of the models out of NVIDIA with the AI model on the left and the ground truth on the right. And I love this video, it's beautiful. And the question is, how's it really doing? Because it's relatively easy to make pretty pictures. So AI for weather and climate has arrived, but something I get a lot of pushback on when I go and talk to my scientific community about this is they say that, that the new insights are lagging behind sort of the new models. And I'm going to suggest, a few ways we're trying to make this change. So one is that our community is still really running the same types of experiments and just taking advantage of the fact that they can be faster or they can do more of them. In a field where chaos reigns, more and more ensemble members or more and more simulations really is a huge boon. However, I think our field really needs to start thinking about completely new experiments or doing things they couldn't do before, rather than just doing faster old ones. So, for example, simulating thousands of possible futures as an example. And this is some new work that we just posted on Archive last week, and saying, we're going to try something new. We're going to move from what are called autoregressive models. So this traditional AI, makes me laugh every time I say this, traditional AI weather emulators, they're traditional in that they've been around for about 3 years, but traditional Emulators typically share this underlying principle of, given the state of the atmosphere or the Earth system at T0, how do we expect the atmosphere to evolve at T0 plus delta T? So this is just really time stepping forward. Why did we set it up this way? Honestly, because this is the way the world works, not discretized, but certainly time moves forward. And also this is what we're used to when we think about our PDEs. So there are other techniques that have not been explored as often. Generative approaches, like in this case, climate in a bottle. This is our sea bottle, which is out of NVIDIA. And sea bottle generates weather states, not forecasts. So the idea here is it takes in the day of the year, the time of day, the monthly sea surface temperatures. So this is an atmosphere only model. And in this case, a data set, because it was trained to actually use both, but we're going to focus here on error 5. So given this, it's in essence a sampler, right? It's a generative modeling. So it in essence samples a weather state that is consistent with these four bullets on the side here. So it generates this plausible atmospheric state given these conditions. Furthermore, they made a video version, sea bottle video, which actually gives 12 different snapshots that all line up in time that could exist, if you will, a plausible atmospheric set of states given these conditions. Now, what's neat about this is this conditioning does not just have to be conditioning at the beginning of this time slice of this video. What this postdoc Jerry Lin in my group has done is he actually has been experimenting with conditioning on different parts of the video, that is, different times throughout this atmospheric state. So imagine here, Jerry's run a bunch of simulations where we actually condition on the first state and the last state at the same time. So we condition on the beginning state with a tropical cyclone further south, and then we condition at the same time on an end state where that tropical cyclone has hit Florida. And what we can do then with Steve Bottle video is actually connect these two together. So create a simulation that is, physically plausible, that connects this beginning state and this end state. And what's really exciting and interesting about this is our physics-based models don't work like this. We can't condition in this way. If you will, our physics-based models really condition on the beginning. Given an initial state, what happens next? So with this approach, we can start our trajectories, can start off similarly, but we can actually have them all end in different places. And in fact, we can also just condition on the end. And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit more about. So here's an example. This is of Superstorm Sandy making landfall. And we have 1,000 different trajectories where instead of starting in the same spot and running forward, we're starting at the same endpoint and running, if you will. Yeah, we're not actually running it. It's not autoregressive. We're working on that right now. But we are generating these trajectories, if you will, backwards. A few things to note. How do we do this without this approach? How have we done this before? Well, in the climate community, we often want to sample the tails of extreme weather events. Those are often where the impacts are. So what we do is we might generate 1,000 members of the climate system, and some of those members may create hurricanes like Superstorm Sandy. And then some of them may have those storms run into the coast, and we select those out to study them. So if you're trying to sample some really extreme tail event, you have to run many, many, many more simulations than you actually need, and you end up throwing out most of them. Now, there are other approaches like rare event sampling that try to tackle this. But here, our approach is, let's not throw out any of them. Let's actually start at the condition that we want to end and go backwards. So when you start doing this kind of conditioning, one question is, how is it working? Is it right? Is it obeying physical laws? Yes, but not always. So in Jerry's work, we have quite a few examples of showing when it succeeds and when it fails. So here's an example of Sandy. The era 5 is in the dashed line. The gray lines are all those different 1,000 members that we simulated, with sea bottle video. And the yellow is the closest trajectory to what actually occurred to Sandy. And we can see here with Sandy that there is in fact a member that looks quite a bit like reality. On the other hand, when you look at Hurricane Ian, we see that era 5, especially a few days before, falls outside of that envelope of what we simulated with sea bottle video, suggesting that there may be some errors and biases here in the model. Another thing, and this is where I'd like to go with this work, is to start thinking about putting probabilities on these trajectories. So this is an example that we ran of the Pacific Northwest heat wave, where we started again at the end condition, and then using sea bottle video generated trajectories of this heat wave over the days before. I'd really like to figure out how to take this approach and the conditioning on both the end and beginning at the same time, and actually try to link that to putting certain probabilities of these extremes and these particular trajectories occurring. So this is ongoing work. One thing I will, yep.
You call this not autoregressive, but in a lot of ways it exactly is, because you're, as I was saying, you're conditioning on the end and you're kind of working your way backwards, right?
Except that sea bottle generates all of those states simultaneously. So it's not truly autoregressive, but we actually we are currently training an actual autoregressive backwards model right now.
So the generation is of a full time series in one shot. Got it.
You got it in one shot. Whereas the next step is quite clearly, well, wait a second, if we have autoregressive models moving forward, why don't we have autoregressive models running backwards? And the answer is, stay tuned. We do. But yes, this is just one shot generation. And one thing, especially if you think about conditioning sea bottle video on the beginning and the end at the same time, is there's nothing that says reality should ever allow those two to be true at the same time. For example, we can absolutely break this approach. Jerry's gone in and had a hurricane starting over Florida and having it end, over the Arctic, where we know hurricanes don't exist, and sea bottle video will happily spit that trajectory out. This is a problem, which is why I'd really like to think about safeguards for sort of a reality check. And I think one way of doing that could be putting probabilities on these particular trajectories. So again, that's ongoing. Another reason we think this is particularly exciting is, here's an example again from Hurricane Ian, and we can start to explore the state space of precursors. So from the 1,000 member ensemble for this landfall, we were able to separate it into members that didn't make landfall over Florida or bypass Florida, and those that did. This can be helpful both for downstream impact studies, so trying to understand the different ways everything unfolded. We were thinking about training new models, so not sea bottle video for weather, but thinking about climate timescales to actually help with planning. For example, you can imagine you want to study the impacts of a certain drought occurring in the season ahead, and so you want to know the different pathways that the climate could lead to such an event. And these are questions we could not really do before. Okay, so again, going from weather to climate is where I think this method could really shine. I think the weather examples are fun, but I think that the climate applications or the longer timescale applications are where this becomes particularly useful. I already said disaster preparedness, infrastructure planning, and thinking about environmental and policy futures. And this is work we've done, this is other work we've done. But just pointing out that huge ensembles do become difficult to scale, and this allows us to directly query these low likelihood events where we can actually put them inside of a larger decision loop that we've been working on for our policy futures work. So we call this rewind, and rewind is only as good as what the underlying AI model can do. But I do want to point out, we know that these models do struggle on the extremes, which ultimately often matter most. So I'd like to talk a bit about some of those issues. So we've shown AI can, these models can sample rare events, but how about their joint statistics? So when we look at their joint statistics in time, so we call these compound events. These are hot and dry events that occur concurrently. On the upper left is era 5, or what we're going to call our ground truth. So this is the frequency of having these particular hot and dry compound events over the last few decades. And then what I'm showing you along this long row is actually new results out of a model in a comparison project that is just wrapping up right now of 6 different AI models where neural GCM here is actually a hybrid model. So it has physics or dynamical components as well as AI-driven components. And the bottom row is the difference between those AI models and the ERA 5 in the upper left. So I think the big point here is that the models actually all look quite different and all have quite, have large biases in the frequency of these events, suggesting that the joint statistics still need some work. Furthermore, if we look across space, so if we look instead across the joint structure in space, this is with a different set of models, but I just want to point out, we're finding that while the marginal skill can look quite good, this is predicting sea level, the variogram or the joint statistics are actually far worse than climatology, really again showing that the joint structure needs to be considered while we're training. And I think we're still figuring out how to do that. Yep.
So can you separate the joint versus climatology? Because climatology includes, are you saying just them one at a time? They're like their averages?
Yeah, so when we say climatology here is sort of like what would happen on average. And that's always our baseline. We want to be able to beat that. And this is showing that trying to understand, this is a score trying to get at how well the model has the different stations vary together. And the point is it does even worse than if we just use climatology as our baseline prediction. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. We want to, at worst, we want to be at the climatological skill. And this is saying this is even worse than that. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, sometimes I'm bringing up vocabulary here, so I appreciate that. So this is some work that recently came out by my PhD student, Jacob Landsberg, that I'm very excited about. So the idea here is that we talk a lot about the fact that these AI models are being trained on past data, but being used to forecast the future, and that climate is changing. And so the question is, will our models trained today generalize to future climates? That is a really important question, I want to be clear, but I actually think there's a question even more interesting than that, which is we've been training on non-stationary data from the beginning, because the last 50 years or so of our training set had a climate that's been changing already. So one question was, how does that training on non-stationary data impact the forecast we're making for tomorrow and the next day? And so I'm going to show you an example here. We started out with the hypothesis that turned out to be correct, that because of this non-stationary in the data, these AI weather models are actually not really forecasting 2026 climate conditions. They're actually forecasting more like the year 2000 or 1990, somewhere in the middle of the distribution. So what I'm showing you here on the upper left is a persistence baseline, and on the right are two different AI weather models. And what's plotted in color is the year that their forecasts distribution match best to. So we make many forecasts, we make a distribution of those forecasts, in this case of temperature, and we compare it to what we know actually happened and those distributions. And we find that even though they're making forecasts for today, for 2026 and 2025, their distributions of forecasts actually look more like the 1990s. And so this has implications, again, not just for future climate in 2040, but for the forecasts we're making for this week, for example. And in fact, another study came out just a few months ago that corroborates this, really showing that physics-based models still outperform our AI forecasts of record-breaking extremes. Because again, it's the extremes where these signals, this non-stationarity is most prominent. And this is work that is published, so you can go look that up. And in fact, as I mentioned, some other work has come out showing that in the extremes, AI weather models are still struggling. And I will point out, I already showed work from C-Bottle, which is in fact not an autoregressive model, but a generative model, a one-shot generative model. And in fact, we are indeed finding issues with the model struggling away from those conditioning endpoints, thinking about the physics itself, what we call the geostrophic balance of the winds and how well it does compared to reality, shown in the dashed line. So there's still work to be done. Furthermore, as part of this this AI NIP, this model in a comparison across many different models, we're finding that certain models actually do well, not because they've learned physics, but because they've memorized our short observational records. So on the right here, one of these models, this is C-bottle again, the generative model that we've been using, appeared to have a wonderful stratospheric circulation, so wind and dynamics, because the blue line, as you can see, lines up so well with the black line, which is our reality or our target. And none of the other models had this fidelity. However, it turns out it's because it's too good. No model should be able to replicate reality this well due to chaos. And so, in fact, it has memorized the data. And it's the light blue line, which is the testing data, where it all falls apart. So again, continuing to figure out how do we keep these models learning physics, doing a good job without memorizing the short data record that we have. So another thing that we found is, and this is taking it from the Lorax here, but the biggering era, at least I think in climate and weather, is ending. And we're starting to reward smart over just big. And that is the final model, I think, is not enough to learn what we need to know and really use these models to the best of their abilities. So my group does quite a bit of work in the area of explainable and interpretable AI. So why study this area at all? If you're a scientist, you're going to say, well, this is what we do. A scientist's goal is to understand why. Of course, we're going to ask that question. But I talk to enough people that are not scientists that actually have to make this slide. And a really good example is I got a call, this is now a few years ago, from a major water manager in California. And she told me, I don't care if you use a magic 8-ball, just give me a good forecast. And my answer is, ooh, if you want a good forecast, you still need to care about why. And here are three reasons. The first is we need a way to gauge trust in these models, especially working in the area of extreme weather and climate. Trust is vital. And one of the ways we can gain trust is by understanding the decision-making process. That turns out to be one of the most important ways humans gauge trust in tools like this. Another reason to care about explainability and interpretability is it helps you fine-tune and optimize your model when it goes wrong. We've certainly made a lot of use of that. We know what it should be looking for or certain signals, and if it's not using those, we can go back and fix it. And then finally, of course, as scientists, we just want to learn new things, and maybe the data-driven model can learn something that we haven't been able to before. And of course, now I have to be careful. Our ultimate goal is to understand causality, and XAI does not give causality, let's be very clear, but it's a great step in the right direction and certainly opens up the conversation of what to try next. So XAI has now been applied successfully to simple climate prediction networks, and I actually think have been really exciting. I'm going to show a simple example here of its power. So this is a very simple feed-forward neural network where we input lagged sea surface temperature maps to try to predict what the climate will look like over the next 5 years' time. All right, so we trained the model. I'm not going to show you all the details. It does okay. Climate prediction is really hard. It does okay, but that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is to then go backwards using certain attribution backpropagation approaches to actually figure out what the network is doing to make it successful predictions. And what we can do is end up with maps like this, heat maps of the regions of the globe that the network uses to make a successful or correct prediction. And yes, you can in fact also look at the wrong predictions and try to fix it. What's really neat is we can start to see different parts of the oceans pop out for different predictions. So when we're forecasting for Mexico or predicting for Mexico, it's the Kuroshio extension off of Japan that really pops out as important. When you're predicting over North America, it's the El Nino region. So we really start to see interesting features that can teach us new sources of predictability of the climate system. But XAI on autoregressive emulators is really hard. This was a simple feed-forward network, and I actually think gives very clean results. But the second you start using these autoregressive models that are taking in the full state of the atmosphere and having to predict the entire state at the next time step, this is an example using GraphCast that, to be honest, trying to explain the Dubai floods and specifically its forecast of them sort of tells you it looks everywhere and it looks nearby more than elsewhere. I'm not sure, we're going to gain all that much information from looking at these, but we're still trying. So these are some new results by one of my, yep.
What you just showed smells a lot like identifying teleconnections in like real climate histories.
Yes.
Is that the same insight, or I guess how can you keep driving that, like the analogy from like real climate analysis to, well, simulated climate analysis?
So this is exactly what we were trying to do that. We are trying to get at these teleconnections. To date in our field, mostly what we use is linear methods to do that. And just correlations. And so what the power here is, just because they're correlated doesn't mean they're necessarily causal, and we're trying to learn what the AI models have learned to get the same result out. So it's the same idea, but instead of just taking a bunch of averages, we're actually trying to use what the network has learned itself. It also allows it to be nonlinear in that sense, which is not how we've done in the past. Another way we do it in physics-based modeling is we use simple models and we go in and we force them in specific places of the globe and watch the waves, if you will, set up and respond to that forcing. But again, typically that has to be linear. We have to assume linearity, which we don't have to do here.
This, on the other side, it sounds a lot like when XAI people who do LLMs do similar things where they chop, the network into concepts or neurons and combinations of neurons into concepts. Is there an equivalent decomposition of Earth phenomena into concepts here?
Right now, not yet, no, but we have that already. So we actually call them, often we call them modes, even though they're not technically mathematical modes, but we think of them that way. And so one can do that, but right now these autoregressive models are not set up to think in terms of modes. They may come out, they may emerge from the model, but they haven't been designed that way from the get-go. That's actually one discussion people have had about interpretability, is what if we sort of feed the ingredients in known blocks rather than just give it all the gridded data and say, have at it, because it becomes a lot harder to understand. But I'm going to talk more. Yep, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll have more questions later, but this is Vanessa.
Okay, great. So we are trying to use some of these XAI methods with these long rollouts of these autoregressive models. So specifically looking at the gradients. This is a really nice new example by a PhD student in my group, where we're using the emulator to predict, not predict, we're just rolling out, apologies, it's not a forecast. We're just running long simulations with a particular AI climate model. But once we run that simulation, we go and we grab Massachusetts temperatures and go backwards through the rollout to try to understand the regions of the globe where the network is most sensitive during that rollout process. And what you can see is, when you're right near the time that if you will, T0, the most sensitive regions for that output are right around Massachusetts. But as you go backwards in time, go backwards through the rollout, you can see the impacts move west. And what that's telling you is that the further back in time you go, the more west the gradients were high, which is exactly what we expect, because weather over North America tends to come from the west and propagate east. We can talk about why that is. So this is starting to show that we can maybe use this approach to explore physical drivers and sources of information. So this is the same idea from that movie shown in a time series. So this is sort of the anomalous gradient. So how important that region is as a function of how far back in time during the rollout we go, with the different colors denoting different parts or regions of the Earth. And what I really love about this plot is it shows, as you go back in time, the local Massachusetts influence decays, as does the local Northeast influence. But we start to see the central US become more important, the East Pacific become more important, and then the West Pacific become more important, which is exactly how our storm tracks run in the Northern Hemisphere. They run from west to east. And then one of the things that I think is particularly nice here as a baseline is we've chosen 3 boxes in the Southern Hemisphere that we know should not have a large contribution over this 50-day time scale. And we use that as a baseline upon which we provide the relative importance of these other regions. So the idea here is there are ways to use XAI with these autoregressive rollouts, but we need to be more creative than we have been thus far. Okay. So predictions, I started off talking about predictions. Predictions tell us what the model can do. And this post-hoc XAI can tell us where they look, right? A blob over the Northwest US. But training potentially tells us how they learn and how they think. And this is where our work is going. I found XAI to be really helpful, but at the end of the day, it just gives me a region of the globe and it says, I looked here, but it doesn't tell me how it looked or what information it was actually using or how it was using it. So instead, we're taking a slightly different approach these days and saying, instead of opening the black box after the fact with these ad hoc XAI approaches, let's watch it be built instead. And by watching the model learn, we might actually have a better intuition about the decision-making process. And in fact, one of the reasons I'm particularly excited about this is something that the LLM world has been exploring for the past few years. So there are now quite a few metrics and approaches out there that we can bring into climate and weather. Specifically, this paper on the right here showing that LLMs abruptly acquire capabilities at specific training moments, and that they can then manipulate those training moments to improve the final result. The thinking here is maybe certain features or modes of the climate system are learned at certain times of the process. What if we could then go and intervene at those times to make sure they're even better? So we're trying to bring this lens to AI and weather and climate models. So typically, what happens during training, for those of you that work in this space, this is the kind of plot you stare at all the time. And this is what it usually looks like. Loss goes down, things look good. So this is the type of plot we'd like to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn training into the experiment here. And we're going to use the AI model to make the same forecast over and over again, and we're going to watch how it learns. So we're going to use a checkpoint. Here I'm referring to a checkpoint once the entire training set has gone through once, and we're going to make a forecast. And then we're going to go to checkpoint 2. So now we've seen the training data twice, and we're going to make exactly the same forecast. Not a new forecast, but for the exact same event. And then 3, and then 4. And we're going to watch its ability to make that forecast change over training. So I want to give you this is a really cute example by Annabelle Wade, a PhD student in my group. What's really fun about it is it's the first example she ever made, and it was beautiful, so we kept it. It looks cherry-picked because it's too good. So we're going to watch the model learn, and then we're going to watch it forget. So we've tested, this is with ForecastNet version 2, so out of NVIDIA. We tasked the AI model to forecast this atmospheric river, so this event along the west coast of the US from 2022, 7 days ahead. So 7-day forecast. And this is the truth. This is the target that we're aiming for. So at checkpoint 1, the model is already able to put some event happening in the correct vicinity, which is honestly pretty amazing to me. At checkpoint 3, it's gotten wider, but it's moved it off of where it actually occurs. We can go to checkpoint 5, 7, 9. And we see the model by checkpoint 15 starting to look pretty good and align pretty darn well with reality. So let's keep going. So far, so good. Let's keep going. So checkpoint 23, checkpoint 20. By checkpoint 25, honestly, the green, the AI forecast, and the gray, the target, look very similar. So this would be considered an excellent forecast. But then what happens? Well, at checkpoint 27, it's as though the model completely forgets how to forecast this event. And in fact, sort of starts over from scratch. In the end, at the final model, the best model for that's been determined by RMSE, which is checkpoint 87, the model does ultimately relearn how to forecast this event. So this is its final forecast with the sort of the best version of the model. But if we'd only looked at the final model, we'd never have known that this had happened during the training process. And in fact, we find this is not just true for atmospheric rivers, but it's also, for their boundaries, but it's also true for their intensity, that it can forget how to forecast its intensity and it has to relearn it again during training. So we're exploring what this means in a variety of ways. In one way, we're actually using this approach to see how input perturbations can reveal when the model learns cross-variable relationships. So earlier I mentioned that models have problems with the joint statistics, so different variables within the Earth system. And what we can do is by analyzing, the x-axis here is checkpoint, by analyzing different checkpoints, we can watch when perturbing one variable starts to impact another. The second that occurs, that means the model has linked those two variables together and may actually be learning physics. So by replacing the winds and the inputs with the average fields, we can identify when the model learns the physics relating, say, the winds and the temperatures together. Furthermore, I will point out that in some cases, the model never recovers from forgetting. This is the same model, but now we're looking at hurricanes instead of at atmospheric rivers. And in fact, there are Hurricane Ian, Cyclone Idai, and Hurricane Dorian are all hurricanes that actually the model does a very good job at forecasting early in the training process, but the final model actually has forgotten how to forecast these events and never recovers. That is, the final model used for, say, weather prediction is unable to forecast these events, even though an earlier version of it could. So the question is why, and can we fix it? Not going too far into the details for this audience, but what we found is we can actually identify what's special about the hurricanes that are forgotten. Specifically, about a third of the hurricanes in the testing set are trained and learned and forgotten midway through the training process. And what is special about those events? So we've looked through layer sensitivities, trying to understand what's going on in the internal components of the network. Ultimately, it looks like it has something to do with the model's linking of moisture in the atmosphere with tropical cyclone development. That is, the model is finding the moisture-driven intensification hardest to retain while it is training. And what's really interesting here, and again, I won't go into all the details, but what's really interesting is I mentioned the LLM community has started finding times when the model learns certain features and they go in and intervene to make it better. This is exactly what we tried here. We actually went in and intervened on the model on this moisture relationship and showed that we could make the unlearning trend disappear and have the ultimate forecast improve. I think this is just
a question.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, is this real? I mean, some other patterns discovered. Show that your metric of test time error goes actually up as the model learns a simpler embed encoding of the same dynamics, which looks exactly like forgetting. But then, as it turns out, it actually ends up better. What phenomena do you see? Is it a proper forgetting or a simplification of dynamics, which is a more refined learning?
Right. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about refined learning. I see. Yes. So I think the word my answer to that is we don't know exactly yet, but I would say take the word forgetting here, not in the typical CSAI forgetting, which has a more strict definition, but more something is changing, so the forecast error goes back up again. So I'm gonna take it's more general right now than forgetting. Does that answer your question?
Right.
Yeah.
Almost.
Because there are many things that could happen.
Yeah. Exactly. So my mental model of effective learning, and this could be ineffective learning in this case, but effective is, you have an overparameterized system where the training algorithm just happens to pick the more normal, boring set of weights out of the infinite set of weights that are possible. Within those, it starts with some setting, and then like the classic example now is if you have a periodic function, what looks like unlearning is it has a kind of memorizing something that's periodic-ish. After a while, it actually captures the periodicity, but in the middle, it looks like it's forgetting, which is actually a process of finding a deeper structure.
I see.
How can you
yes.
to like maybe it's finding real physics, or
and we stopped it in the middle of that process.
Right? Like, and how could you know such things?
Right. So I think, one way to do that would be to keep running it out and see what happens. I think one thing that's a little, well, I don't know if it's different than the nice example you just gave, is when I show this, people always say, well, why don't you just train a tropical cyclone model only and then just make it better?
Right.
And the answer is totally, you can do that. But that is not why these models were generated. just like our physics models, we have tailored TC physics models, but we also have weather prediction models that predict everything everywhere. The same is going to be true, I think, for AI models. We can have bespoke tailored TC models, but we're not going to completely give up on our global weather forecasting systems. And because of that, I think we're never going to be perfecting the models only for hurricanes, those models only for hurricanes, because there are also heat waves and droughts and fronts that and tornadoes that we need to also forecast. To answer your question, could it be trying to learn something more complex and we just stopped it too early? It's absolutely true that could be happening, and I in no way can refute that, other than just say this is the model that's the final model that's chosen is chosen by the lowest RMSE across all of the variables that are across all forecasts in the testing set, not just the hurricanes. So
Right.
we'd
And
have to start.
actually,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, nice. Oh, and then since you brought up these targeted hurricane models and heat wave models, to what extent are they useful as tutors for these more general models?
I don't know of anybody that's done that. That's a great
Okay,
question.
makes sense. Yeah,
That's
cool.
very cool.
Yeah,
We've done them separately, but I don't know of folks that
right.
have done them together.
Because it sounds like they're more accurate, at least for that one modality. So cool.
Totally. Not to, sorry, we could have a whole conversation, but I will point out one of the downsides of those types of models is we do only have a limited training set, really since about
Right, right.
1979. And so the second you get more and more bespoke, you actually really risk overfitting. There's something about being able to train over the whole physics of the system and learn the intricacies of how wind and temperature and moisture all interact, and then apply it to a TC environment rather than only train on when we have a tropical cyclone, which is only a few hundred days, or
Fair,
it's
fair.
not every
Yeah.
day. So it's a tough. It's not obvious what the answer is, but I think it's a great thing to try. Okay, so just about done here. So again, training dynamics, I think, can start to reveal how AI models think. And this has been, you've watched just in this talk, my progression between ad hoc or post-hoc, post-hoc XAI. I also have quite a bit of work on in building interpretable models from the ground up. And now I'm starting to think watching the learning process might actually be yet another way that we can get at why is the model doing what it's doing. And this is something we're seeing across multiple models, and it's happening within the latent representations, and it's helping us identify cross-variable relationships and see when the models are learning physics. So really, I think an ultimate goal would be, if we could get there, is we watch the model train, we locate times within that training process of particular features being learned, if that's occurring, and then we can go in and intervene on those to make them better, like the case of tropical cyclones. This is, I will say, optimistic. I think there is work that also shows that these models aren't learning in this way, and there will never be a part of the model that is the TC portion of the model or the heat wave portion of the model. But I think we don't know yet if that's true, and so I've been really excited about looking into it. Okay, so just in wrapping up here, I thought I'd end with things that I think our field either is stuck on or things that I'm concerned about in this space for our field. So just maybe some food for thought. First, I do think we're really starting to enter the smarter, not just bigger space. And the bottleneck is shifting from compute to understanding. So one of the things that makes our field so special is first, people outside of it get so excited when they see all of our beautiful gridded data at multiple levels of the atmosphere, all packaged so nicely. On the other hand, that's all we have. We don't have any more than that. We can't go back in time and put satellites up in the 1920s. And because of that, that data set is relatively constrained and small when you're talking about time scales beyond a few hours or a few days. In terms of independent samples, we actually don't have that many. And so I think we're going to start to see far more emphasis on the being smart with the data that we have, because we can't just go make new data. Especially for weather and climate, where trust is so essential to someone being willing to, leave their home to evacuate or go into a basement because of severe weather hazards, having a bunch of AI slop come out would be a huge problem. So the hype and rapid pace of untested products means that we may irreparably damage trust. And unlike before, where building these models and building these forecast systems was incredibly time consuming and expensive, now it's inexpensive and easy to do things poorly, especially given different groups' willingness to be wrong on these forecasts. And so this is something I think, and I don't mean as a field in academia, I mean as a field of folks studying weather and climate prediction, we're going to want to be very, very thoughtful about. I think renewed emphasis on interpretability is imminent. Again, this links with the trust, but we will find ourselves asking how much explainability is enough for action, and how can we achieve it. I don't think black boxes ultimately will be tolerated, for many of the reasons I've discussed today. And then finally, this is maybe we're not stuck here, but this is something I'm incredibly interested in and have some folks thinking about, which is that the calibration of extreme event frequencies is really difficult to assess given the non-stationarity of historical training data. There are multiple papers coming out now of stochastic generative modeling and these autoregressive large ensembles, but the calibration is really hard to quantify given that we don't even know how frequent these extreme events are happening today. So the implications of this non-stationary training data, I think, are largely unexplored and is ripe for research. And with that, I will thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So, a few questions. A lot of what you've been focusing on has been implicitly about the quality of the embeddings that these models, create, and you kind of surfing gradients backwards and so on. One approach to that actively focuses on embeddings is JEPA, which is, normally you say good means good predictions, and you hope that the internal dynamics are right. JEPA says no, make sure the internal dynamics are consistent, and fingers crossed physically. But it seems to be extra important in earth science, where embeddings are supposed to be, in some sense, physics equations, but faster. I guess what's the opportunity and challenge of an approach like JEPA applied to this system?
Yeah, I think, okay, I'll just throw out some ideas. I think one thing is, I guess we're not totally sure what those embeddings should look like. Two, something that I struggle with personally, internally, so forget the AI for a second, is when we think about those embeddings, are we thinking about location invariant embeddings, or are we thinking about embeddings that are true for each sort of, if you will, grid cell separately? Like how general are we making this? Like the laws of physics certainly are not location dependent. There's one, if you think of it that way, there's one set of laws of physics and they apply everywhere. But given how many degrees of freedom our atmosphere alone has, we have to simplify. It's unlikely we're going to learn those basic laws of physics perfectly, especially since we don't even know what they are. So one question I have is, what will those good embeddings look like? Will they be location invariant? Will they be location dependent? And then how does that structure unfold? Where am I going with this? Just one second. I just had a thought and then it vanished. I think some folks that have started to look at the interior of these models are finding that something is like a tropical cyclone, which I would argue is a very clear single entity. You can actually anybody could take a marker and draw a line around a hurricane and say, this is the hurricane and this isn't. Like, we actually know what that is. And yet the models are not learning it that way. The weights are activating all, like, throughout the model, if you will. There isn't sort of like a TC space. And yet they're still doing a good job with forecasting and predicting these events. That has given me pause, because it means the way I'm thinking about these models and how they're actually training may not align. So that's my answer there is
Yeah.
I don't know if we're ready yet, because at least my conceptual model, I think, is flawed.
Okay, so then
yeah.
my conceptual model of JEPA, which is, let's say, coming from a numerical like simulation background, I'll say it like that,
great.
is what makes for a good physical laws or good low degree approximation of the God knows what physical laws. It is that okay, how am I going to think about it? I did a finite difference approximation of the dynamics, and it was the same, grid size everywhere. But no, that's silly. I'm going to do adaptive measure refinement, where the action is happening, where there's like big gradients are happening. That's why I want to make it tight. Why? So the gradients are not so big. They're not that different in space and time. But where no action is happening, well, bigger grid cells allow me to do the same thing. Cool. But then I want to say, well, I can keep doing that intuition by effectively saying that what makes for good approximate physical laws, it's that the embeddings are the same in nearby places. Embeddings are similar in nearby places, and do whatever it takes to make it that. And then if embeddings with this property that also make good predictions should be roughly physical. And I'm not sure anybody knows whether that's true, but I think it's the idea.
That's the idea. Yeah. I think, okay. Just this is not in any way the side note. The data we're training on when we get at those fine scales is actually known to be wrong. So that is another
interesting
complication. Is Era 5 actually was never meant to be used for the small scales, because we don't know how those small scales work. We don't know how to simulate them in our physics models, because we don't even actually know the physics ourselves. So one of the things that makes this also challenging is, even if you did an amazing job at training on this data set, you could still have terrible forecasts of what actually happens in the real world, because ultimately you were training on synthetic data to begin with, which I think that makes sense. So we have an extra complication here. So I agree with you in principle, but now we have to throw in the fact that the training set that's so nicely curated may not actually be physical itself. But that's a side point. I think that's a more common that's a more common issue that people understand.
Yeah, I mean, Era 5 came from a simulation too.
Exactly.
And then, like, last question. Yes, we are very constrained by the data that's available, but from another perspective, we kind of are not. We know fluid dynamics. We have plenty of examples of water flowing in many scenarios, and arguably neural GCM kind of rides that by saying, well, the physical
Why
core.
Why are we forgetting this? Yeah, Navier-Stokes.
Exactly.
We actually know Navier-Stokes. Why have we?
Can we pre-train?
Yeah. So totally with water, but the atmosphere is far more complex than that, unfortunately. Navier-Stokes is great, but all the chemistry and all of the thermodynamics going on, we don't understand all of that. We don't understand radiation. We've got figured out radiation code. We know quite well. However, we don't know the constituents of our atmosphere very well. And this is only with the atmosphere. Now we have to bring in the land, the ocean, and the ice, which are all vital components beyond about 12 days. So if you want to do any sort of simulation that leaves that rolls out or that simulates beyond about 12 days from your initialization, it is not only an atmosphere problem. So all the models, Neural GCM, ForecastNet, ACE out of AI2 that I just showed here, they are all using sea surface temperatures that were given from some other data set, if you will. They're acting like it's a boundary value problem, but we don't actually know what the future sea surface temperatures are going to look like. These models are using fixed sea ice or sea ice from some other data source of sort of an oracle. None of them have anything resembling land, which is why I think they struggle on things like heat waves and drought, which are the land processes, and the drying of the land is critical. And I will point out, sea ice, the ocean, and the land do not have Navier-Stokes. So in principle, if you'd like to simulate an atmosphere-only dry Earth, spinning Earth, which, by the way, I did my PhD on that. So, but If that's what you want to do, then I agree with you. But unfortunately, or fortunately, there are far more pieces than that.
Are there teams doing experimental? Okay, so I remember teams doing like water tanks over surface roughness or funny
Yeah,
shapes of lakes and so on. I can slam an air body into fake Rocky Mountains in principle.
yeah, yep.
I don't know if it's a sensible thing to do, like in the physical lab, right?
Yeah.
But that could be a data set as well.
Totally. So people have done those things. There are wind tunnels, right? Especially when you go to people thinking about cities. So we call this meteorology, which I find fascinating, which is let's go down to how wind flows between tall buildings, right? That's where some of these lab experiments have been incredibly useful. When we're talking about the scales that we've been talking about today, however, just slamming it into a fake Rocky Mountains is, at this point, we know what that flow looks like. We're talking about the fact that there are trees in this one section and grasses in the other that actually end up making a big difference. The last piece I will say, you brought up mountains. One of the things that make mountains so tricky isn't the terrain itself, which is tricky, but actually how it interacts with cloud processes as the air rises. And cloud processes are something we do not have equations for. We do not know how they work. And that's one of the biggest uncertainties in our understanding of weather and climate to date.
Yeah, and those are the some phenomena for which you just learn in your own and move on with your life.
Yes, that's what people are
right.
trying. Exactly. Yep.
All right, awesome. Well, yeah, thank you very much.
Great.
It was really insightful and valuable.